What are the 11 worst things to forget to pack for your cruise? I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. I want to take a look at 11 things that would just be terrible, really bad, if you didn't pack them on your cruise. Starting with this one, the obvious ones. There's three absolute obvious things that you need to pack, and you probably could get away with your whole cruise if you only packed these three things. First of all, your passport. Now, certainly you could argue that on some cruises you don't really need your passport. So for example, there are what's known as closed loop cruises. These are cruises that sail out of the US and they go from the same port and come back to the same port. Certainly at the time of recording, the regulations said that you didn't specifically need a passport. However, I would really recommend that you travel with a passport, because if you have any issues or whatever, having a passport is going to make it so much easier for getting back or repatriating if you need to. A passport needs to have normally at least 6 months before it expires if you're going to use a passport and for your passport to be accepted. So certainly passport, of course, you could get away with some other form of ID if that's appropriate to get on your cruise. Second thing that you need is a credit card. That's also very important because cruise lines generally won't take debit cards, or they require you to deposit a lot of cash to cover any onboard expenses. So credit card is what most cruise lines require. Of course, you can then think about taking debit cards or whatever else. And then the third thing that you need is an e-ticket. Increasingly what's happening is cruise lines require you to have checked in online and have an e-ticket which they scan when you board. Normally, if you don't have it, you can find a way of getting around it. But those are certainly the three absolutely essential things. If you have those three things, you could probably go on your cruise, and everything else you can just sort out with either your passport, your money, or the fact that you're on board. The second thing that I recommend you take, though, is some sort of government photo ID. So obviously you've got your passport, but I don't like taking my passport out and about with me. And you'll find in some ports you're required, when you go out on an excursion or self-exploring, to have some sort of photo ID with you, some government issued photo ID with you. I don't like that of taking my passport out. I like to take my government photo driving license, because if I lose that, it's less traumatic and less problematic replacing that than it is a passport. So some sort of government ID, it's really a good idea to have that with you. It means you can then leave your passport. Also, in some itineraries, you'll find that the cruise line actually keeps your passport, and that's because they're going through lots of different immigration places, so they keep it to be able to process that. So having some sort of ID is going to be really helpful when you're heading out in port. It's good to have ID with you in case you get into trouble or problems. You have some sort of ID. The third thing that I would recommend you never leave behind if you're going on a cruise is your mobile phone, for all sorts of reasons. One of them is actually quite a practical reason, and that's because many cruise lines have shifted to use apps online, some sort of interactive stuff, and they will normally give you access to use all of their apps, where you will manage your account, you can book restaurants, you can book excursions, you can check your bill, you can do all sorts of things on your mobile phone. So actually having that becomes a fundamental part of the way that you do your actual cruising. So that's very important. You might not use it for anything else, but you'll find increasingly as cruise lines move more and more to technology, that's very important. Obviously, you have the obvious things. If there's an emergency or you want to stay in touch or whatever, you've got your mobile phone. Also, the thing that I find a mobile phone really helpful for is, of course, increasingly using it as a camera to save you taking out bulky camera equipment. But also you'll find there's lots and lots of apps you can have on there that help you. So particularly if you're going self-exploring, you can do things like look at the hop on hop off bus timetable. You can order Ubers or taxis. You can do a translate. So for example, I have actually seen a Japanese tourist who has a little translation, a voice translation app on their phone. And when they're traveling, they talk into it, it translates it into the language, allow the person talks back, and it converts it back into Japanese. So there's lots of technology things. You can have a currency converter to check when you're thinking buying something, is that a good price or not. So lots and lots of apps on your phone to make your whole travel experience much easier, guides, all sorts of things. So mobile phone from that perspective, really, really helpful, even if you don't use it for its prime thing, which is making calls or using the internet. The next thing that you should absolutely not travel without are things that fall into the medical category. There's the obvious one, which is prescription drugs. If you do take prescription drugs, you need to take those, take plenty of those to cover yourself. Good idea to take copies of the prescription or copies of the bottle if you have any issues to show the doctor or whatever. But also there's a couple of other things related to medical that I strongly recommend you take. I always take a little personalized first aid kit. Going to the medical center can be very expensive. You can't buy a lot of the over-the-counter things on the ship. If you then in a country where you don't understand the language or whatever, trying to navigate around the pharmacy can be very difficult. So what I always do is a little first aid kit where you might have things like headache pills, seasickness tablets, antidiarrheals, things for mouth ulcers, all kind of stuff like that that you might need. Also, you might have some plasters in there, you know, so if you cut yourself or whatever, you've got plasters in there. So all the sort of daily bits and pieces, just little niggles that you might have, because it could become quite expensive and difficult to replace those or find those, certainly if you have to go to the medical center. So a really good idea to have a little personalized medical kit. Other key things, of course, things like sunscreen, insect repellent, all stuff like that that you might need depending on the location. One of the things that quite a few ladies have told me is they always make sure they take is that they've taken plenty of feminine hygiene products, because they can sometimes be very difficult to get on the ship, or you can't get the exact product or brand or whatever that you want. So think about those kind of things and make sure that you've got those. The next thing I've actually made as a whole separate topic, and this is really, really important, is on cruise ships there is no dentist. So if you do have a medical issue on cruise ships, in the ocean cruise ships, you have a medical center, so you can go and get things sorted out. However, if you have a dental problem, there's no dentist on board and they can't help you for all sorts of, I guess, legal reasons and being sued or whatever, and expertise. So actually, if you have a problem with your teeth, it could be a real problem, particularly if you've got something with lots of sea days. So I always take one of those little patch-up kits. You can buy them in a drugstore, in a pharmacy, and you can do things like put back crowns or fill a filling or a broken tooth. And a couple of times I've either been traveling with friends or my partner or myself where part of a tooth's cracked off or a crown's fallen off, and to be able to patch it up until we've got to a port, we can actually arrange to see sort of an emergency dentist, or sometimes even until you get back. So one of the key things is that dental repair kit. I know so many people that it has been an absolute boon for. The other thing that I would strongly recommend that you make sure you pack is some sort of backup of all your critical documents. Now, the easiest way to do that is to take a picture and store it on your phone and your photos, or scan it in and have it in the cloud. Things I would recommend you have is like your passport, copies of your medical insurance, perhaps even a copy of your photo ID, perhaps some of your emergency contacts. Basically key documents that if you were stranded or you needed them, you can show a copy of your passport or travel insurance. So have a little folder somewhere on your phone, a little album where you keep that sort of stuff. Hopefully you'll never have to use it, but if you do need to use it, you're going to be so pleased. That's also perhaps where you could store stuff like a copy of your prescription or photographs of the bottles that your prescription drugs come in. The next area that I personally have found has been really, really helpful is when it comes to glasses. Now I wear glasses for reading and I'm very clumsy and I'm always sitting on them, breaking them, whatever. So I always make sure I've taken a backup pair. So it might be very simple, one of those inexpensive reading glasses that you can just buy in a pharmacy. I actually have an old pair of glasses that I take with me because I have lost glasses, and if you do need glasses, it's really, really difficult to replace them really quickly. If it's reading glasses, you can perhaps find those more inexpensive ones that are easy to do. So I would always take a backup of your actual glasses. The other thing I would always take is a backup for sunglasses. This is something that I learned the hard way on a recent cruise in Asia. I'd actually dropped my glasses and they fell into the river and they disappeared. And then because we were going to lots of remote places, I found it really, really hard to actually replace my sunglasses because I was actually on a river cruise boat, so they didn't have a shop there. So I actually found it was really helpful to have a backup pair of sunglasses. The only sunglasses I could find were some knockoff ones in a little market, and I realized they were going to be really bad for my eyes. So having backup for glasses really important, particularly if you're going somewhere sunny, but really those prescription ones really, really critical. The next area is around adapters and chargers. We rely so much on technology these days, so particularly if you're going to have your phone or your camera or all sorts of bits and pieces that need charging. One of the things to think about is not only make sure that you've got all the different chargers, because as we know, as phones upgrade, they have different chargers. Different people in the family might need different plug-in things. The good news is many cruise ships, both ocean and river, are increasingly having USB chargers, so you don't have to worry as much about the different charger types. But assume that you don't have the USB chargers and you're going to need all the different plugs. Very importantly, the adapters to go with those. Most cruise ships are actually built in Europe. However, they tend to have more US style plugs. A lot of them will have mostly US style plugs, maybe some Euro plugs. So make sure you've got adapters. So I like to take the adapters that actually you can set for different regions, so you don't have to think too much about I need US style and Euro style. Also, one of the things you might want to do, although cruise lines are clamping down on that, is don't assume that you have lots of plug-in points. So see whether your cruise line allows you to bring some sort of extension cord. Very importantly, they do not allow extension cords with surge protectors, and some of them are very strict and won't let any on board. So double check that, but certainly take lots of adapters and plugs so you don't suddenly find your phones run out or your cameras run out or your tablets run out, and that could just drive you crazy. The other worst thing to forget to pack is appropriate clothing, and there's probably three critical things that you should think about. First of all, dress code. So depending on the cruise line you're on, you want to make sure that you brought appropriate clothes. So if you're on a very formal cruise, like a Cunard, for example, where they have formal nights where you have to wear jackets or you have to wear tuxedos or fancy glitzy gowns to get into the dining room, make sure you brought that. Of course, if you're going on a cruise which has a much more relaxed approach, you don't want to be taking all your tuxedos and ball gowns. So appropriate clothing to the dress code. The second thing is you might want to take clothing linked to the parties. So different cruise lines have different parties. It might be a red, white and blue party, a white party, or some other themed party. So make sure that you've checked that and you've taken appropriate clothing so you can really get into the swing of things. The third area of appropriate clothing is you want to make sure that based on the excursions or where you're going to, you've got the right clothing. So you don't want to head off to Alaska, particularly when it can be rainy and you haven't got any clothes that are layered to keep you warm or waterproof outers so that you can stay dry. You don't want to head off because you're going on excursions and you don't have the walking boots or whatever it is. Just make sure that you've got appropriate clothing to the region and the sort of excursions you're doing. The next thing that I strongly recommend you pack is think about a shore excursions bag. If you're heading out, there's probably bits and pieces that you want to take on a shore excursion, and make sure you've got a bag, particularly a bag that is relatively secure, so some sort of rucksack, but one that's not easy for pickpockets to do. So it's got lots of zips inside, or if you're heading off and you're going to be on the beach and you're taking some valuables, your phone or money to the beach, perhaps one of those little waterproof bags that you can either wear when you go in the sea, or you can sort of, what I like to do is bury them in the sand when I head off to the sea, so it's quite hard for people to lift. So something that you can take, go off an excursion. Now, obviously, some cruise lines will also give you little hold-all bags as well that you can use. So take something that you can use on your excursions. That's a real plus. Another thing that I think is a terrible thing not to pack is think about your nighttime sleeping experience. Some people go as far because they're really fussy about their pillow. They take their own pillow. You don't necessarily need to do that. Many cruise lines will give you a choice of pillows. If it's a feather pillow or whatever that you need, you can normally find they can sort that out for you. But for example, you might want to take eye shades or earplugs or a white noise machine or whatever you know is good for giving you a great night's sleep, because you never quite know what it's going to be like. So for example, you could be going on a cruise into Northern Europe where the sun never goes down, so it's light all the time. And if you're the sort of person that likes to sleep when it's dark and you've got a balcony cabin or an ocean view cabin, you might be very grateful you've brought some eye shades for that or whatever it is. So whatever the things are that help you sleep well at night, that's something that I strongly recommend that you pack. I have loads more videos of packing advice, cruising advice, so why don't you watch another one of those right now.